Good evening. It's Wednesday, the 15th of December, 2021. Welcome to Behind the Headlines. I'm Regan King, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Simon Barrett. This evening, we're asking a very important question, and that question is, could a Russian invasion of Ukraine lead to World War III? Could a Russian invasion of Ukraine lead to World War III? U.S. intelligence shows, Simon, that Russian President Vladimir Putin may be considering a large assault, an invasion on Ukraine territory with around 100,000 Russian troops on the border. Now, there's a bit of complication because Ukraine only has around 60,000 soldiers deployed in active duty at the moment. They can call upon a significant number of reservists from the civilian ranks as such, but only 60,000 currently deployed who are able at this moment, should there be an imminent invasion. So they would be vastly overwhelmed. 100,000 plus Russian soldiers already near the border of Ukraine. You have 60,000 deployed Ukrainian soldiers across the country. It doesn't look promising. Russian officials have accused Kiev of hysteria regarding troop movement. They say this is nothing. They have the right to move troops around, which, okay, on one way, yes, they are their troops. They have the right inside their own borders. But this is all on the back of an ongoing conflict that really sparked up in around 2014 and accelerated in 2016. Simon, what do you think?
I think the situation is extremely precarious. I think it's potentially a big you have a situation where we could see a kind of powder keg just explode. The fact is now that Russia has deployed over 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border. And before, I think when we did a program similar to this one back in April, it was about 60,000. Then he pulled those troops back. But military experts are saying they reckon it's going to be, Putin will need about 160,000 troops in order to invade Ukraine. Now, the big question is, what is he up to?
Right.
Is he doing this for posturing to make sure that the Ukraine doesn't come under the umbrella of NATO and become a NATO member? Is he doing this to push back the West? Or does he have visions of grandeur in which he wants the whole of Ukrainian territory to be under the control and the influence of Russia and also other European states as well, the former Baltic states, Poland. I mean, we know for a fact that Poland now has the largest army in Europe. So the situation in Eastern Europe is getting very dangerous. And particularly as we look at the historical context of this, it was back in 2014 that we saw that Russian forces, through Russian separatists, invaded large parts of Ukraine. I think over 14,000 people have died since then. They annexed the port of Crimea and took over that, control that territory. The West was silent. And again, I think this is again Putin posturing and testing the weak leadership of Biden in the United States to see how he would react and what would do, because that's what dictators do. But there is no doubt that we could potentially see a mass escalation of tension and even war, particularly if NATO gets involved, and a conflict between NATO and Russia is very precarious. Put into the mix the fact now that Putin has wanted to deploy nuclear weapons, we could see that this could end up sparking into a nuclear conflict. And I think what this shows is how fragile the world is today. Whether it's flashpoints in Ukraine, whether it's flashpoints in between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, whether it's Israel, Iran, whether it's China and Taiwan and the South China Seas, we're seeing an increasing number of places in the world where we're seeing flashpoints. So I think this is something we should take very seriously, and this is something that needs a lot of prayer, because it only needs something to go wrong, and we could find out that this could trigger a major European war, the likes we haven't seen for 80 years.
Just a reminder to our viewers that we are live and interactive, so please do send in your thoughts, your own, if you have any personal experience or knowledge on this subject, please feel free to share. Let's go now to a news report from CBN, which gives a bit of a breakdown as to what's happening.
The United States is sending a clear message to Russia: invade U.S. ally Ukraine and we will respond.
What we've seen in recent weeks is a steady and unusual military buildup by the Russians along Ukraine's borders.
It comes as President Biden prepares to meet virtually with Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who's expected to demand that Ukraine never joins NATO. The CIA Director William Burns.
I would never underestimate President Putin's risk appetite on Ukraine. The President's conversation was an opportunity to reinforce, to reemphasize the costs of a use of force, but to also emphasize of renewed military aggression, but to also emphasize the importance of de-escalation and a renewed effort at diplomacy.
Satellite images show Russian troops amassed on Ukraine's border, with U.S. intelligence warning that Russia is planning an offensive early next year with 175,000 troops. This is the front line of frozen landscape scarred by fighting.
We've consulted significantly with our allies and believe we have a path forward that would impose significant and severe harm on the Russian economy.
The White House says it's considering a range of options if Putin invades. Among them, sanctions, including the possibility of cutting Russia out of the international financial payment system, which could hurt it economically. Another possibility, providing more U.S. forces to Ukraine. Bradley Bowman with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies telling CBN News the U.S. should prepare for the worst.
It may be that only Putin knows what he's going to do, and he may not even know. At a minimum, what he's doing is clear. He's trying to use military power to get a diplomatic outcome.
Meanwhile, it's not just Russia. The Biden administration facing other major potential global threats. China also building up its strength. As the Wall Street Journal reports, classified U.S. intelligence suggests it may establish its first permanent military base on the Atlantic Ocean, on the west coast of Africa. A threat setting off alarm bells in Washington. And the administration has announced a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics to protest China's human rights abuses, something China calls a provocation. And then there's Iran and restarted talks aimed at restoring the 2015 nuclear deal. But so far, no deal, and it doesn't look like Iran is budging. The Iranians continuing to provocatively accelerate their nuclear program. For now, though, Russia's potential move against Ukraine is the top concern. And here in Washington, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are urging President Biden to take a firm stance with Vladimir Putin. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Thanks to our friends from CBN for that helpful breakdown. It's always good to hear from regular viewers. We have an email here this evening from Anita. Anita, thank you for your faithful viewing of this program and always sending in your thoughts. Hi, Simon and Regan. It's lovely to see you both. The situation is very serious indeed. The Guardian, there was a special online article about this, and they are certainly concerned about this invasion. Mom and I have been praying daily for peace between these nations. And the Guardian headline, I'll just read this out: Russia edges closer to war as new arms arrive on Ukraine's border. A recent sighting of Putin's notorious Buk missiles on their way to the front line does not bode well for talks. Even as Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin were sitting down to talks meant to end the crisis, Russia was inching closer to being ready to launch a full-scale ground invasion of its neighbor. This is a very real possibility and a great cause for concern. It is reminiscent of the catalyst that set off World War I and World War II. Now, Simon, the question that we're asking this evening is admittedly a bit extreme, right? Could we see a Russian...
I wouldn't say extreme, maybe a bit sensational. But
maybe a bit sensational, right? It's sensational. So could a Russian invasion of Ukraine spark World War III? Well, technically we could say yes, it could. But the reason that I feel it's an important question to ask is those who don't study history and those who don't learn from history's lessons, the saying goes, are doomed to repeat it. And I think the Guardian taps into something that I've definitely noticed in observing this as a possibility. while it seems like it's fairly isolated to that region and fairly insignificant. Well, okay, this is a scrap that's been ongoing in some way since 2014 between Russia and Ukraine. What is it that could cause this this to become the powder keg that I think it is, leading to a potential global conflict? If you look at World War I and World War II, you have some similar things going on. You have the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, which seems like a very minor, on the grand scheme of things, incident. But so many alliances had been made in the previous century that had to be kept, and this led to full-blown war. In relation to World War II, of course, Hitler and the Third Reich advancing, encroaching on, invading other nations. If Russia invades Ukraine and Ukraine is accepted, and that has to be fairly imminent, into NATO, then NATO, and we've already mentioned that the G7 leaders, they've promised massive consequences. That's a quote, massive consequences should Russia invade. It seems like there might be a domino effect, and that this could actually lead to these nations becoming involved in some sort of conflict.
I think essentially, if Putin carries on his tactics at the moment, which is a kind of long-term strategy of kind of undermining Ukrainian sovereignty, he invades Ukraine, say in January of next year. NATO doesn't respond, Biden doesn't respond, then what we're seeing then is the West repeating the same mistakes as we made with Hitler in the 1930s. And that is adopting a policy of appeasement. And then you'll see that once Putin and Russian forces are in the Ukraine, what's to stop them from attacking the Baltic states? What is then to stop him from going after Poland or the Czech Republic or the former Soviet republics that belonged to Russia during the Cold War? There's nothing. And a weak America is very, very, very dangerous for the world. And we've already seen through the notes we've gone through here that that President Biden is very reluctant to engage in any sort of like military conflict with Russia at all. What becomes complicated is the fact that President Clinton and also our former Prime Minister John Major actually signed a defense pact with the Ukraine, that if the Ukraine is invaded, then the United States and Britain will go to the defense of the Ukraine. Now, we know they're not going to do that. And also, I think Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has also mentioned the fact that because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, therefore we will not come to the defense of the Ukraine, but we will supply Ukraine with the military hardware, weapons, tanks, probably satellite equipment to actually repel any Russian invasion. But the last thing we want to see really on the continent of Europe is another major war, and this could escalate, particularly if Putin decides to deploy kind of nuclear weapons which have a range of 3,000 miles and could hit virtually all European capitals. That is a big game changer, and if he wants to do that and keep the control of the Ukraine so it doesn't become part of NATO, then potentially sooner or later we're going to see a big military clash.
We have a question here. Didn't the Ukraine get rid of their nuclear weapons with the understanding the West would protect them? These are dangerous times and only Christians have the answer. God bless you. That's very true.
That's a very informative and an impressive email from the viewer who sent that in, because that's absolutely correct. And that, I think, was part of the original defense policy that was made between Bill Clinton and John Major and other Western leaders in the mid-90s.
It's in the aftermath of the breakdown of the USSR. And look, Simon, I think from my observation of this, there's not only the tension between Ukraine and Russia, this is creating a very tense situation. It has done for some years now between Western states. It's creating tension across the G7, definitely, but it's creating tension between the United States and Russia. Did the Cold War, maybe this is another question for another time, but did the Cold War really end? Did we just have a reprieve, in effect, in application?
Well, it's very different from the Cold War, because the Cold War was two polarizing powers. You know, the United States representing the capitalist West of America, and the Russians representing the Soviet Union and the communist Marxist style ideology. We still have kind of social Marxism or cultural Marxism, but that is not the overriding ideology of Russia, and certainly under Putin's Russia. But this is more about restoring Russia's honor, restoring Russia's pride, and for Russia itself and Putin to be considered a kind of major power against the West. So, you know, he's ex-KGB, trained his whole life in the KGB. I think he has one kind of a political objective, and that's to see the destruction of the United States of America and to take over the control of Eastern Europe. So he's done everything he can since he's been president to undermine not only NATO, but also the EU. And we also saw that in the last French presidential elections, he was actually supporting the far-right candidate, Marine Le Pen, in trying to get her to support her to become the next French president. In return, she would pull France out of NATO. And this is what he's been doing in Europe, and this is what he's been scheming. He's an unprecedentedly powerful leader that has designs on reconquering, I think, Eastern Europe, ideologically.
Simon, consistently, Forbes magazine has voted Putin the most powerful person in the world. They've done that, I'm aware of at least 4 occasions where they voted him and highlighted him as the most powerful person in the world. Certainly, he's extremely influential in decisions being made even in the West. If we do have sanctions that go against Russia at some point that are more extreme and more advanced, should they invade Ukraine, that will have impact on us to some degree in the West as well. Russia has in many ways isolated itself and cut itself off from our realm of Western democracy, but it is still very influential in the global scene of the world, which is why I think Biden is wanting to try to talk things through, but as you quite rightly pointed out, this is essentially amounting to a policy of appeasement. Look, they took over a whole region that's not theirs, and as you said, the West did nothing, done nothing. So they already did invade Ukraine. They already have a patch of Ukraine that they've claimed as theirs. Let me just remind viewers of why we're at this point. It's really helpful to put this into the immediate context. Now, the crisis began all the way back in November 2013 in Kiev. It occurred when there were protests that became very violent, actually, against the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych's decision to reject a deal for greater economic integration with the European Union. This is something that's been ongoing, Ukraine's involvement with the EU. After a violent crackdown by state security forces drew even greater numbers of protesters and only served to fuel the flames of that, so to speak, Yanukovych fled the country in February of 2014. That left Ukraine in an unstable situation. And one of the things that Putin has showed he's excellent at, I'm sure even as a KGB person, perhaps in his moonlighting as a taxi driver as well, apparently he did that between jobs, but he took advantage of a weak situation here. Right? In March 2014, Russian troops took control of the Crimean region. We can go far back and see that that's been a hotly contested region. There was a whole war, the Crimean War, over that. But
we're not going to get into that now.
We're not getting into that, not tonight. But they then formally annexed the peninsula after Crimeans then voted to join the Russian Federation in a disputed local referendum, and that's heavily disputed local referendum. Yes, there's separatists, I think about 30,000 potentially, who are in that region, but still not their territory, not really their choice, not Russia's right to enter into a territory that was not theirs. Now, Putin cited the need to protect the rights of Russian citizens, and he viewed these people as Russian citizens and Russian speakers in Crimea and Southeast
But
Ukraine.
didn't someone else use the same language?
Yes.
Hitler did as well.
Exactly.
The Sudetenland in what was then Czechoslovakia in order to take over the Sudetenland.
We have to protect these people.
Yeah, these are Russian-speaking people. There are people. Yep. Therefore, we were grieved at the Treaty of Versailles. So therefore, we need this territory. But I suppose talking about this situation, I mean, talk to us through the shooting down of the Malaysian flight back in 2014.
Well, that's when it escalated. And in July 2014, the situation became really an international crisis and put the United States and the EU odds with Russia because you'll remember it was a very, very bad period of time for Malaysian Airlines. But a Malaysian airline flight was shot down over Ukrainian airspace, killing all 298 on board. There had already been an issue or two with some Malaysian air flights elsewhere. So when this happened initially, the question was, what happened? You know, is it another crash? Was there a storm? Or is it something wrong with Malaysian airplanes? What's going on? It emerges that, that Russia shot it down. And so the Dutch air accident investigators, they concluded in October 2018 that the plane had been downed by a Russian-built surface-to-air missile. September 2016, investigators said that the missile system was provided by Russia, determining it was moved into eastern Ukraine and then back to Russian territory following the downing of the airplane, which is it makes it even more complicated to some degree.
Also, I think another factor is the economic factor we need to do with this one, and this is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And this is a pipeline that's been agreed between Russia and Germany. The previous pipeline actually went through the Ukraine, in which Ukraine ended up having making a lot of money. It was a kind of very wealthy endeavor on behalf of the Ukrainians, but this new pipeline goes under the Baltic Sea, and this is in a direct agreement between Germany and Russia, which completely bypasses the Ukraine. We saw that previous administrations, such as the Obama administration, even the Trump administration, completely rejected this, meaning that Europe would be completely dependent upon Russia. But the Biden administration allowed this to go ahead, and this is one of the major sources of conflict now. So we also see that this pipeline is potentially causing huge problems. And we've already seen that this year as well, that Putin has put up the price of gas, in which we're all paying that price for now.
We have some emails here. Very good evening to you, Simon and Regan. Thank you for doing a show on this subject. We've been here many times before, such as the 80s Cold War standoff and films like Threads. Did either of you see that? I've not seen that one. Did you see that one? I've not seen it. That's from Robert. Robert also says it is inevitable that nuclear World War III will be triggered, whether it is Russia or more likely Iran who do this. We were talking about Iran's potential in this situation, Simon. It will happen before October next year, but it will be stopped in its tracks. This is Robert's view here by Satan's alien deception and his UFO technologies. Please start to look into this coming deception, as it will cause great falling away. Interestingly, Robert, we covered UFOs and their role. Exactly, it was this time last year, so you can probably find that on YouTube. We discussed UFOs in depth and the potential role that they have in all of this. John says, going to war over a corrupt, failed state like Ukraine would be lunacy. Now, John, I have visited Ukraine on a couple of occasions, and according to one of my friends who is there, in his terminology, Ukraine is corrupt, as many other countries in that region are. It's just a way of life. I wouldn't quite go so far from what I've seen to say that it's a totally failed state, any more so than others in that region, which may not be saying much, but I wouldn't quite go that far. US and UK have just withdrawn in humiliation from Afghanistan, so not best time to dive back into a confrontation with a nuclear power. Bear in mind, we also are nuclear powers in this situation. I don't particularly trust Putin, but nor do I put much faith in our woefully inadequate leadership. pretty much with you there. Anthony says, God day and greetings to you both in Yeshua Messiah. We've heard rumors that the real reason for the military presence and buildup of Russian troops in northern Ukraine is that they are waiting and preparing to come down upon Israel, while everyone else around the world are thinking it's just all about Ukraine. What do you both think? Could that be a possibility? That's from Wayne and Wind. Thank you both for that email. This is something that is going to happen at some point. In prophecy, we do see that Russia attempts to invade.
Well, there are Russian troops in Syria propping up Assad's regime, and we've already seen an alliance between Russia, Turkey and Iran to reshape Syria and the Middle East. So at the moment, if we see something like 100,000 or 200,000 troops and weapons massing in Syria and heading towards Israel's border on the Golan Heights, then we should be concerned. But it's a question of deployment. At the moment, we're seeing 100,000 Russian troops on the border of the Ukraine, not in Syria and not in Turkey or anywhere else in the Middle East. So we're not really yet seeing that fulfillment of biblical prophecy in Ezekiel 38 and 39. But I want to make an interesting point, because what we have to ask ourselves, what are President Putin's motives for a potential war with the Ukraine? And it says here that Putin has described the collapse of the USSR, the Soviet Union, which separated millions of intermarried families on either side of the Ukrainian border, as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and has questioned the grounds on which the Ukraine broke off from Russia. And following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, Putin likened the Ukrainian peninsula, where Vladimir the Great, the first Christian ruler of Russia, a medieval state ruled from Kiev, was baptized in the year 988 AD, known as Russia's Temple Mount, a notion that has theological basis but has cast Putin as the protector of Russians everywhere. And in July, President Putin published a 5,000-word article, said, on the history, unity of Russia and the Ukrainians, in which he wrote he was convicted that the true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia, and he vowed that Moscow would never allow the country to become anti-Russia. And that's the big thing. This would be catastrophic for Putin, for his pride, if the Ukraine became a member of NATO, and this would be a direct strategic threat to Russia, even though I don't think that NATO would actually invade the Soviet Union or Russia. And certainly wouldn't invade like Hitler's Nazi Germany did in the summer of 1941. NATO wouldn't do that, but we're pretty sure that that this is not what Putin thinks. He thinks that the presence of NATO forces and right on his border with Russia is just one that's a humiliation too far for him.
Ken has some questions that are related to your observations there, Simon, and he says he really enjoys the topics that we tackle on Behind the Headlines. What don't the UK and US work through NATO to admit? Why don't the UK and US work through NATO to admit Ukraine and so preempt Putin's moves? Putin wouldn't think we would do that because he sees us as a soft touch to see we will stand up to him. Also, we could look at other diplomatic means of putting the pressure right back onto Putin. What do you guys think? Keep up the great work. From Ken. Thoughts?
I don't think that Biden has any stomach for any kind of military confrontation. We've seen the devastation caused by the war in Iraq in 2003, the Afghan war in 2001, in which only now American troops were pulled out of Afghanistan in a horrendous manner. I don't think America wants to be the world policeman anymore, particularly under President Biden. But the difference is between Biden and Trump that Trump had this unpredictable nature to him, which scared dictators.
Don't mess.
So if you do a wrong move with Trump, then he could quite happily kind of press the red button, because no one knew what to expect with him, and it kept the world a safer place. He pushed back the Iranian threat. He pushed back the terror threat. He even brought South Korea to the negotiating table, something that the Democrats have never been able to do over the conflict with North Korea. Earlier in the week, I had an interview with Major General Tim Cross, and this is his perspective, a military perspective on the situation now on the Ukraine's border, with Putin amassing over 100,000 troops. Now joined on Behind the Headlines by Major General Tim Cross, CBE, who served with the British Army with distinction. Tim, it's great that you can join us on Behind the Headlines as we discuss the crisis in the Ukraine. What are your thoughts on the fact that Putin is building up Russian forces to about 100,000 on the Ukrainian borders, and we're hearing news reports that war could be imminent?
Yeah, it's obviously a worrying time. It's not something that's happened in the relatively short period of the last 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, this has been going on for quite a long time. It inevitably goes back to the initial move into Ukraine that the Russians undertook when they seized the Crimea and a chunk of the western side, the eastern side of Ukraine. And over the summer, there were some major exercises the Soviets were running, and they moved quite a lot of equipment up to the border. They then moved quite a lot of it away again. And this lot is, the latest in that sort of push and pull that's been going on over for several months. So I don't think there's any doubt at all that Russia is putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine. Ukrainian people, certainly, reports from within Ukraine, is that they expect them to try to conduct some sort of military operation. There are various options for that, which we can discuss. So I don't think there's any doubt it's a serious issue. There is the potential for military action, but I don't, like all these things, I think one has to try and maintain a balance of the politics that's going on, the economics that are driving this, and the broader strategic picture, which includes, for example, pulling out of Afghanistan in the way that we did, which sent a pretty powerful message of not very capable withdrawal, and the other big issues.
What do you think that President Putin is hoping to achieve, not only escalating the tension on Ukraine's borders with 100,000 troops, but also risking a military confrontation with NATO at the same time?
Yeah, well, I think his calculation is, well, first of all, it's worth saying, which I think we may have discussed before, but Putin is an old-style Soviet Union man. He genuinely believes that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Not Germany invading Russia back in 1941, not the whole of World War II, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he has been determined to try to regain the losses that occurred over that period from 1989 through till first decade of the 21st century, really. Now, he's not about to try and occupy all of the old Warsaw Pact countries that fought alongside or would have fought alongside the Russians in the Cold War, but he has been determined to increase his influence over them and to try to build what he would see as a barrier between himself, Russia, and the West. And he sees himself as a major power. He wants to be taken seriously. And I think we can easily lose sight of that. Now, I'm not saying he's a nice bloke, but nonetheless, if you see things from their perspective, he wants to be taken seriously. So what he's prepared to do is to put pressure on and keep pushing to see how the West will react. Now, interestingly, the West have made it very clear. One of the issues here within this context is that Ukraine has asked to join NATO. It's not yet a NATO member, and NATO may or may not allow Ukraine to join. It's given the indication that it probably would. That, for Russia, for Putin, is a bit of a red line. In fact, it's a pretty major red line. And part of this pressure is to say, NATO, do not take Ukraine under your wing. Ukraine, Crimea, these other areas in this are traditionally Russian. They've been Russian for a long, long time, as in hundreds of years. And all we're doing is reclaiming what is rightfully ours, he would say. So if you allow Ukraine to join NATO, then that is a major issue for us. Now, we have responded thus far, and I don't think there's any doubt in my mind at all that this is as far as we would go, with saying that there will be economic sanctions if they were to use military force. Now, there are lots of ways they can use military force, from a major invasion to try and take on particularly the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine further west, or they can use what's called grey zone warfare, what's called hybrid warfare. disinformation, putting in Spetsnaz, putting in all sorts of things to give disinformation and destabilize Ukraine. And as I think at some point, they probably would be prepared if they managed to pull together the sort of fake news picture that the Russian-speaking people want to be liberated from Ukraine, rather like Germany did in the run-up to World War II in places like Czechoslovakia and so forth. So my sense is that there could be war fighting, but probably not. I think Russia will continue to put pressure on and may use some military capability, but NATO's response will be economic, not military. Now, we've given a lot of military capability to the Ukrainians, and they are in a much stronger position than they were 3 or 4 years ago when Putin moved in to the Crimea. So they would fight. There's no doubt about that. But if it was a major Russian incursion, I don't think they'd win. At the end of the day, the Russians are too powerful for that. But so if they try something small, I think the Ukrainians can probably give them a bit of a bloody nose and cause quite severe casualties. So like all these things, Putin will be weighing up the odds on this. My own view is he wants to try to maintain the pressure, undermine Ukraine, undermine the authorities, undermine NATO, the sort of unity of NATO, really, because a lot of countries are not going to start fighting over the Ukraine. And those economic issues we can talk about in a second, but they could be quite severe for Russia.
Sure. Isn't the West under obligations from a military agreement that President Bill Clinton signed with John Major with the Ukraine in the 1990s that meant that if there was a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine, then the United States and Britain is obliged to come to the defense of Ukraine. Do you think that President Biden will honor that commitment?
No, I don't think so. It's not an agreement as in the context of NATO, where during the Cold War, a move against any of the NATO members was considered to be a move against all. So Article 5 would kick in and so forth. This was a sort of guarantee of Ukrainian sovereignty that we're talking about with Clinton and the UK. So like a lot of these things, there'll be get out clauses and so forth. And my sense is that Biden would not fight over Ukraine unless there was, and I suppose at the end of the spectrum, if there was a major military takeover of the whole of Ukraine. But I can't personally see that happening. But I may be wrong.
Tim, you discussed the economic factors, and sometimes when we're looking at major military confrontations, there is an underlying political issues that are taking place, but also economic issues. What do you think are the economic issues that is driving Putin to build up 100,000 plus troops on Ukraine's border?
Well, Russia is its GDP is not huge. It's not like China. It spends a lot of its GDP on its military. It is pressing not just NATO, but we've got to see this in the context of the broader European Union. So Russia is trying to get again, it's trying to influence and also make certainly part of the European Union dependent on Russian energy, for example. So it already provides quite a lot of gas, and it stopped providing that gas earlier this year, which resulted in this gas spike in prices on the pretext that it needed the gas for themselves. But actually that was a run into the opening of this, what's called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, there is a pipeline that currently runs through Ukraine that brings gas into Europe. And Ukraine get paid quite a lot of money for allowing it to move through their territory. Nord Stream 2 is a pipeline that runs under the North Sea and bypasses Ukraine completely. And therefore, Ukraine would get no money coming through because Russia would stop pushing gas through that original pipeline. Now, that pipeline is 99% complete. And the Germans were on the verge of giving their permission, if you like, agreement that the thing could be opened and gas would move down that pipeline into Europe. On the Russian point of view, that's important because it would bring in a lot of revenue. From a European point of view, it means that they will become ever more dependent on Russia for its energy supplies. And Russia sees that as a major lever that they can pull at any time. And that's what worries a lot of people in the West, that if the Germans allow this to go through, every time there's a bit of trouble, the Russians will say, well, if you don't go along with what we're saying, we're just going to stop pushing gas down the Nord Stream. Interestingly, Germany today actually have strongly hinted that if Russia were to take military action in Ukraine, they would not allow the Nord Stream 2 to go through. Now, that's easy to say, and actually I think that's right, personally. But Germany, we don't want to get sucked into German politics, but Germany made some strategic decisions a few years ago, which actually they're living with the consequences of. They closed all their nuclear power stations, which was frankly ridiculous. They burn more coal than anybody else in Europe, I think, and certainly a heck of a lot more than we do. And they are, growingly dependent on coal, but also renewable. They've made a statement that they want to be much more dependent on renewable within the next 10, 15 years. So the whole energy issue, I don't want to bang on about it, but the whole energy issue in terms of Germany is a big issue. And for the Russians too, it can be an important issue in terms of revenue. The rest of the economic piece is what you do in any of these circumstances. It's about trade, it's about buying from Russia, it's about selling to Russia, it's about diplomatic pressure in terms of sending people back to Russia, not closing, but curtailing in embassies and diplomacy and so on. And so there's a whole what I would call lines of operation that you can play here, different tunes you can play, of which the military would be part, because we would probably certainly sell more kit to Ukraine or give more kit to Ukraine. I think Joe Biden would do that. We might do that. We've given them a lot already to help them fight. But I think we have certainly thus far, publicly, Biden in particular has made it clear he's not prepared to fight a major war over certainly a relatively small incursion into Ukraine.
And Tim, finally, as Christians, how can we pray into this situation to pray for the protection of Ukrainian sovereignty with any military incursion by Russia into the Ukraine, and also for the future stability and protection of Europe?
Yeah, well, it's a big issue and there's lots to pray about. But I was having a conversation this morning with a very good friend of mine who used to be the Bishop of Bath and Wells, Peter Price. And we were chatting about a lot of issues, but including this. One of the issues today for us collectively is that because of the experiences of Afghanistan and Iraq, there's no doubt that the appetite within the West for getting involved in these sorts of military operations has drained away. Tony Blair's speech in 1999 in Chicago which led to the responsibility to protect, for example, you could argue that if Russia moves into the Ukraine, then we have a responsibility to protect the people who are going to suffer as a result of that. But the West's appetite for that undoubtedly has diminished as a result of Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, not doing things, all choices carry consequences. Choosing not to engage will carry consequences, and the consequences clearly will fall on the Ukrainian people. And a lot have already died in the last 3 or 4 years, and a lot continue to die. I mean, people are manning trenches in the Ukraine on a daily basis, sending out fighting patrols, and a lot of the Ukrainian people are now part of the reserve. So there's a sort of homeland mobilization, if you like, not quite a dad's army, but that a reserve contingent. These people, a lot of people would die, and a lot of people would subsequently die, if there was a Russian occupation. So we need to pray that the wise minds will be able to work their way through this problem. And we should pray for Putin. We should pray for Joe Biden. We should pray for our own government, and indeed the NATO governments and the EU countries, which is a pretty broad canvas to pray for. But we need to pray for wisdom for our leaders, as we're told to do anyway in Romans and so on. We then need to pray for the people of Ukraine,
absolutely,
who are suffering as a result of all of this. Suffering in some cases, very terribly. I mean, in parts of Ukraine, further west, you wouldn't even know there was anything happening. But to the eastern area and around the area where they have been taken over, there's a lot of people who are suffering hard. So we need to pray for that. The interesting conversation I had with Peter this morning was, will we ever get to a time? Are we evolving into a better world where warfare is we're less inclined to go to war?
Well, very helpful comments there. Thank you for that interview, Simon, and also Major Tim. We have fitting in a little bit with where Major Tim was concluding there.
Major General.
Major General.
Oh,
sorry, correct.
Sorry, I have to correct you.
You have to correct me. Forgive me. Major General Tim Cross. President Biden has said that putting American troops on the ground in Ukraine is not on the table. He said that categorically. So that means that we have a couple of options here from the U.S. perspective at this present time. Obviously, things can and do change. One is pursue appeasement, some sort of diplomatic route through this. Another would be to supply some weaponry that could assist should there be an invasion. The intelligence is indicating that if there's to be an invasion, it will come around January time, when the very soft marshy ground of the area in which the Russian troops seem to be gathering will be frozen over, and tanks will be able to have easy access. They have been amassing tanks as part of this gathering number of troops. So what they will need is particular anti-tank missiles, and those will be supplied by the U.S. So that's one way in which the U.S. could get involved, but of course that will continue to freeze over relations with Russia as well.
I mean, I did hear news reports last week that President Biden was saying that he's willing to give huge territorial concessions to Russia in the Ukraine, which would be absolutely disastrous, and then it would just give Putin more hunger to take more and more territory. In yesterday's Telegraph, there's a very, very interesting article, a disturbing article actually, says Russia warns of nuclear deployment in Europe. Moscow does not trust NATO and says it's willing to respond to tensions with mid-range missiles. It says here that Russia yesterday threatened to deploy intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe, escalating its standoff with the West over the Ukraine. Sergei Ryabkov, Russia's deputy foreign minister, said Moscow would turn to the missiles, which have a range of over 3,000 miles and could hit European capitals. If NATO did not pledge never to use its nuclear weapons, intermediate-range forces, say, were banned under the 1987, under the treaty signed by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and US President Ronald Reagan, but essentially saying that Russia could deploy nuclear weapons, which makes this whole situation far more dangerous and far more serious. And this is the kind of strange world that we're living in, is that our mainstream media news are dominated by COVID and the new variant, Omicron, and yet we're seeing these massive, big foreign news stories that could explode in front of our faces being completely ignored, and that's a great danger. That's why I think Behind the Headlines is so important, because we need to discuss geostrategic news stories that have a huge impact on the world that we're living in, but also give us a kind of prophetic understanding of the precarious times that we're living in.
Absolutely. We have some emails here. This is from Mike. Yes, this is well possible, but maybe not yet inevitable. However, there are differences between this and the Cold War period. Now we have poor, hopeless leadership in the West. Trudeau, Biden, Johnson, etc. are all morally and ethically inept. I have to agree with that. And the West is corrupt in what is generating right across the board, led by corrupt leaders. And now to expect Biden to offer any substance of any opposition is merely whistling in the wind. Spiritually, there's a judgment that is well overdue to the West, and this or something similar in the predictable future could bring it on. It is clear that when the scenario finally plays itself out, the West will be utterly humiliated. We need to prepare for this both politically and especially spiritually. Really agree with Mike there on that, and definitely we have to consider, we've talked about it on this program, that so far as we can tell, there is no place where America is in Bible prophecy. And so Russia is, however, and that has to be taken into account. Russia is a much more powerful force.
And China as well.
And China as well, absolutely. We have another observation from Anita, Sky News headline. Ukraine, a full invasion by Russia could trigger World War III, warns government minister in Kiev. And Anita observes they clearly think World War III could be a possibility. Satinder says the Russian Barrett is on the move. Looks like the situation between Russia and Ukraine is deteriorating fast. The infamous Book M1 medium-range surface-to-air missile has now been seen on its way to the border between the two countries. This is the same missile system which shot down the Malaysian MH17 airliner in 2014, killing all 298 people on board, which we were talking about earlier. Russian troops are now reportedly only 50 yards away from the Ukrainian border. It also appears Russia is to station its intermediate nuclear missiles in Europe from Monday, each with a range of 5,000 kilometers. Russia is evidently threatened by NATO's expansion to the east, and it's been suggested they're using these hostilities to reach some sort of agreement for their own reassurance. However, we know from Scripture they are a major player in the end times, heading the coalition of countries which come against Israel, Iran being one of those as well. Georgia is one of the countries in Russia's path when they eventually come down from the north against Israel. We already know from history that Georgia got pulverized by Russia in 2008, and now it looks like it's the turn of Ukraine.
Yeah, very much so. And it depends where it goes from here. I mean, it depends whether Putin decides to have a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine, probably the end of January in 2022, next year, or whether he continues to play the long game and tries to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty by more and more incursions, using Russian separatists and supplying them with weapons and missiles as a pretext to launch further military operations into the Ukraine, or whether he can get a guarantee from the West that the Ukraine will not become a member of NATO, and that Ukraine becomes a buffer state or buffer nation between Europe's NATO countries and that of Russia. But one thing we're seeing really, and we've seen this really since COVID-19 in particular, is the breakdown of the world order that was built after the ashes of the Second World War.
Putin has many military options on the table. That this could go in a range of directions. I was reading an article earlier from retired Brigadier General Kevin Ryan, writing for The Hill, and he gives a breakdown of some of the situation as pertains to Georgia, which was mentioned just a moment ago, and speaks of some of the outposts Russia has in different places, but highlights something interesting that we've not really touched on, but something this story's not going away, Simon. We'll probably be touching on it again at some point, just as we did earlier in this year. The retired Brigadier General Kevin Ryan says, finally, Turkey could play an unexpected role if the U.S. and West can convince it that Turkey's security is also threatened by an expansionist Russia. Under the Montreux Convention, a treaty that regulates the passage of ships between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, Turkey has control over the strait connecting the two bodies of water. In accordance with Articles 20 and 21 of the Convention, if Turkey feels it is in imminent danger of war, it has the right to permit or restrict the passage of any ships it chooses. Turkey could declare that a war in Ukraine would present a danger to Turkey, allowing it to grant passage to an unlimited number of Western warships while restricting Russian passage. Such a step would quickly tilt the balance of power against Russia in the Black Sea region, something Turkey might find beneficial to its own long-term security interest. And it's this sort of scenario where you look on the surface of it and you think, oh, Turkey? Hold on, that's random. But it's the inclusion of these other states and their interest that we might at first consider that makes this a possibility for World War III.
Absolutely. Regan, it's great to be doing a programme with you. Very much enjoyed it. Look forward to next week, and want to thank you for watching this programme. We need to be vigilant. We need to be watchmen on the walls of Jerusalem. We need to understand the times in which we're living in and to become like the sons of Issachar, so we can discern and understand the seasons. So thank you for watching today's Behind the Headlines.